The air in the Sterling Grand Hotel's celestial ballroom was like the inside of a diamond, cold, clear, and crushingly expensive. Light from a dozen crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small carriage, fractured across the marble floors, which gleamed like frozen rivers. The low hum of conversation was a carefully curated symphony of old money and new power, a sound insulated from the grimy, striving world outside. This was a place where silence itself had a price tag, where the spaces between words were filled with the rustle of silk and the clink of ice in $100 glasses of scotch. At the center of this glittering universe, holding court from a plush velvet armchair, sat Julian Croft. He was a man built of sharp angles and polished surfaces. His suit was a midnight blue so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it, tailored with a precision that bordered on aggression. On his wrist, a platinum watch caught the chandelier glare, its face a constellation of tiny, perfect gears. Julian's wealth was not a quiet companion. It was a weapon he wielded with casual, brutal effectiveness. His smile was thin as a paper cut, a fleeting expression that never reached his eyes. Those eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept the room with a bored predator's gaze, assessing, categorizing, and dismissing everything they saw. To him, people were balance sheets, their worth tallied in stock portfolios and social connections. He felt a familiar ennui settle over him, a silken shroud of discontent. The party, a charity gala he had funded purely for the tax deduction and the public adulation, was a tedious parade of sycophants and rivals. Their fawning praise was as empty as their champagne flutes. He craved a disruption, a crack in the flawless, boring facade of the evening. Along the far wall, a man moved with a practiced invisibility. He was a ghost in a gray janitor's uniform, his presence meant to be felt only in its absence. A polished floor, an empty trash receptacle. This was Elias Vance. His face was a quiet landscape of gentle lines, etched by a sorrow that had long since become a part of him. His hands, though clean, were calloused and rough, the hands of a man who worked while others celebrated. They were hands that had once known the delicate grace of piano keys, but now only knew the cold metal of a dustpan and the rough wood of a broom handle. Elias kept his eyes downcast, his focus entirely on the small universe of scuff marks and spilled drops he was tasked to erase. He was not a part of this world. He was merely the man who cleaned up its messes. Each sweep of his cloth across the polished brass railings was a small, dignified act of defiance against the chaos of his own life. He had lost everything that mattered years ago, and in the wreckage, he had found a strange peace in the simplicity of this work. It was honest. It was quiet. It demanded nothing of his shattered heart. The object that drew his gaze again and again was the grand piano on the small, elevated stage. It was a magnificent creature of polished ebony and ivory, its lid propped open like a waiting mouth. A single microphone on a slender stand stood beside it, bathed in a solitary, hopeful spotlight. That stage was a memory of another life, a life where his voice had been his fortune, his joy, his everything. A life before the silence fell. Julian's cold eyes, scanning the room for any form of distraction, finally snagged on the gray, unassuming figure of the janitor. An idea, cruel and glittering, began to form in his mind. It was perfect. A little performance to liven up the dull proceedings. A demonstration of power. He watched Elias for a moment longer, a faint, contemptuous curl on his lip. The man was a nullity, a zero on the grand ledger of life. He was exactly what Julian despised, a man without ambition, without presence, without wealth, a piece of the scenery. And Julian Croft loved nothing more than making the scenery move to his command. With a flick of his wrist, he beckoned one of his associates. "That man," Julian said, his voice a low murmur, ice wrapped in velvet. "The janitor, bring him to me." The associate, a nervous young man eager to please, scurried away. Elias, who had just finished wiping a smudge from a gilded mirror, felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see the anxious face of the young man in the expensive suit. "Mr. Croft wants to see you," the man said, his tone a mixture of apology and command. Elias's heart gave a small, nervous flutter. He had spent years perfecting the art of being unseen. To be summoned by the most powerful man in the room felt like a violation, like being dragged from the shadows into a blinding, unwelcome light. He nodded silently, placed his cleaning cloth in his cart, and followed the man across the vast expanse of marble, his worn work boots squeaking softly against the polished stone. The crowd of elegant guests parted before them, their curious, disdainful glances falling upon Elias like tiny, sharp stones. He felt the heat of their judgment on his cheeks, the stark contrast between his simple gray uniform and their designer gowns and tuxedos. He was an ink blot on a pristine page, a discordant note in their perfect symphony. He stopped a respectful distance from Julian Croft's chair. The billionaire did not look at him immediately, forcing Elias to stand there, an object of public scrutiny, while he finished a sip of his drink. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, Julian lowered his glass and looked up, his eyes sweeping over Elias from head to toe in a slow, insulting appraisal. "You there?" he began, his voice carrying easily in the suddenly quiet room. "You look like a man who could use some money." Elias said nothing. He simply stood, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture one of quiet dignity. Julian chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of gold coins, custom-minted $100 pieces he sometimes used for vulgar tips. He held them up, letting them catch the light. The guests leaned in, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and cruel amusement. "I'm bored," Julian announced to the room at large. "This party is a bore. It needs entertainment." He turned his gaze back to Elias, his smile widening into a smirk. "I have a proposition for you, janitor. I hear the help in these places often have hidden talents, little party tricks." He gestured toward the stage, toward the gleaming piano and the solitary microphone. "Go up there," Julian commanded, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Sing us a song. Make us laugh." He tossed the gold coins onto the marble floor. They landed with a series of sharp, metallic clicks, scattering around Elias's worn boots. The sound was obscene in the opulent silence. "Sing, clown," Julian Croft declared, his voice dripping with contempt. "Sing for your supper. All of this is yours if you can manage to entertain us." The room erupted in a wave of scattered, cruel laughter. It was the laughter of people who had never known desperation, who saw the humiliation of another human being as a spectator sport. Some guests looked away, their faces etched with discomfort, but none dared to speak out against Julian Croft. His power was absolute in this room. They were his audience, and he was their ringmaster. Elias stood frozen, the laughter washing over him. Each chuckle was a physical blow. He looked down at the gold coins gleaming on the floor. They were a mockery, a symbol of the vast, unbridgeable chasm between his world and theirs. He could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on him, dissecting him, judging him. The heat of shame crept up his neck, a burning tide of humiliation. His first instinct was to turn and walk away, to retreat to the quiet dignity of his shadows. But then Julian spoke again, his voice laced with a final dismissive barb. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or is a man like you simply not capable of producing anything but filth?" Something inside Elias shifted. It wasn't anger that rose in him, but a profound, aching sorrow. He thought of his wife, Clara. She had loved his voice. She had been the one to encourage him, to believe in him, to see the star that he could be. "Your voice is a gift, Elian," she used to say, using his stage name. "It's not yours to keep. It's meant to be shared." For years since her death, he had kept that gift locked away, buried under a mountain of grief. He had silenced the best part of himself because it was too painful to remember the joy it had once brought him. He looked from the coins on the floor to the microphone on the stage. He saw Julian's smug, cruel face and the eager, mocking eyes of the crowd. And in that moment, he realized that walking away would be the true humiliation. To let this man, this hollow man of ice and money, define him by his uniform would be a betrayal of everything Clara had believed in. It would be a betrayal of himself. A quiet determination settled over him, extinguishing the fire of his shame. He would not sing for their money. He would not sing for their amusement. He would sing for her. Slowly, deliberately, Elias bent down. Not to pick up the coins, but to carefully push them aside with the toe of his boot. He straightened up and met Julian Croft's gaze directly for the first time. There was no anger in his eyes, only a deep, bottomless calm that seemed to unnerve the billionaire. Without a word, Elias turned and walked toward the stage. The laughter in the room sputtered out, replaced by a murmur of confused anticipation. His steps were steady and measured. He was no longer the invisible janitor. He was a man with a purpose. He ascended the 3 short steps to the stage. He did not go to the piano. Instead, he walked directly to the microphone stand. He adjusted its height with a familiar, practiced movement, his calloused fingers wrapping around the cool metal. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment, and in the darkness, he saw Clara's smiling face. He opened his eyes and looked out at the sea of stunned, silent faces. He did not look at Julian. He looked past him, past all of them, to a place only he could see. And then he sang. What came out of his mouth was not the tentative, reedy warble they expected. It was not a clown's song. It was a sound so pure, so powerful, so utterly unexpected that it seemed to physically push the air from the room. It was the opening bars of Nessun Dorma, an aria of triumphant, heartbreaking love. Elias's voice was a force of nature. It was a torrent of sound that filled every corner of the vast ballroom, vibrating in the crystal of the chandeliers and in the bones of every person present. It was a voice of immense training and impossible talent. A rich, resonant tenor that soared with effortless grace to the highest, most difficult notes. It was a voice that spoke of love and loss, of despair and hope. A voice that had been silenced by grief but had lost none of its power. It was a cathedral of grief and beauty, built in the space of a single breath. The entire room was frozen. Champagne glasses stopped halfway to lips. Conversations died in mid-syllable. The cruel smiles on the faces of the guests melted away, replaced by expressions of slack-jawed, utter disbelief. They were not listening to a janitor. They were listening to a master. They were in the presence of something real and profound, something their money could not buy, and their cynicism could not touch. Julian Croft was the most stunned of all. He sat rigid in his chair, his knuckles white where he gripped the velvet arms. His face was a mask of shock. The man he had tried to humiliate, the insignificant clown he had thrown coins at, was producing a sound of such shattering beauty that it defied all logic. It was an impossibility. This janitor, this nothing, was singing with the voice of an angel, an avenging angel. The aria swelled to its famous, powerful crescendo. Elias's voice climbed, note by perfect note, to the final, sustained, Vincerò, I will win. He held the note, pouring every ounce of his pain, his memory, and his soul into it. It was not a boast. It was a declaration of survival. It was a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. When the final note faded into the cavernous silence, it was as if a spell had been broken. For a long moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The only sound was the faint, lingering echo of that impossible voice. Then someone in the back began to clap. A single, tentative sound. It was followed by another, and then the entire room erupted in a thunderous, spontaneous ovation. It was not the polite, reserved applause of a society gala. It was a roar of genuine, overwhelming emotion. People were on their feet, their faces streaked with tears, shouting, "Bravo!" They were no longer applauding a janitor. They were honoring an artist of world-class caliber. Elias stood on the stage, his chest heaving, the applause washing over him like a warm, healing rain. He gave a slight, dignified bow, a gesture of profound grace. He had not won Julian's bet. He had transcended it. Amid the chaos of the ovation, a distinguished, silver-haired man pushed his way through the crowd toward the stage. His face was pale with excitement and recognition. He was Alistair Finch, the world's most respected music critic, a man whose opinion could make or break careers. He had been a guest at the gala, bored and unimpressed, until this moment. He reached the foot of the stage and looked up at Elias, his eyes shining with a kind of holy reverence. "My God," Finch said, his voice trembling. "It is you. I thought I was dreaming. I thought you were lost forever." The crowd quieted, eager to hear what he would say. "I don't understand," someone near the front murmured. Finch turned to the assembled guests, his voice ringing with authority. "You people have no idea what you have just witnessed," he declared. "This is not just a man with a good voice. This is Elian Vance." A gasp rippled through the room. The name was legendary in the world of classical music. Elian Vance had been a prodigy, a tenor destined for greatness, whose debut album had been hailed as the most promising in a generation. And then, nearly a decade ago, he had vanished completely after a personal tragedy. Elian Vance, Finch continued, his voice thick with emotion, was poised to become the greatest tenor of our time. His voice, a voice like his, comes along once in a century. And we, he said, now turning his fiery gaze directly on the still-frozen Julian Croft. We just watched a man try to buy that voice for a handful of coins. The full weight of the moment crashed down on Julian. The humiliation he had intended for Elias had reversed its course, returning to him with the force of a tidal wave. He had not just been cruel, he had been ignorant. He had mistaken a priceless masterpiece for a worthless trinket. In his arrogance, he had exposed his own profound bankruptcy, not of money, but of soul, of perception, of humanity. The applause for Elias had now turned into a low murmur of condemnation directed at Julian. The same people who had laughed at his cruel joke were now staring at him with contempt. In the world of the ultra-rich, There were few sins greater than being publicly, spectacularly wrong. Before Julian could even process the full scope of his disaster, another figure approached him. It was Mr. Sterling, the elderly, dignified owner of the hotel. His face, usually a mask of polite hospitality, was now a portrait of cold fury. "Croft," Sterling said, his voice low but carrying the unmistakable weight of finality. "Get out." Julian stared at him, bewildered. "What?" "You heard me," Sterling said, his eyes like chips of ice. "You have brought a stain of profound ugliness into my establishment. You have attempted to debase a man of immense worth, and in doing so, have revealed yourself to have none. You are no longer welcome here. Not tonight. Not ever." Security guards, discreet but immovable, appeared at Julian's side. The message was clear. His evening was over. His reign in this room was over. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. By the time Julian was being silently escorted out a side entrance, phone screens were already lighting up the ballroom. A guest who had been recording the entire exchange had uploaded the video. It was spreading like wildfire, captioned with devastating titles. "Billionaire Julian Croft humiliates janitor, gets shock of his life," or more simply, "The voice that silenced a tyrant." Julian's world, so carefully constructed on a foundation of power and reputation, began to crumble in minutes. His phone started buzzing incessantly, with calls from his board of directors, from investors, from his public relations team. The story was a PR nuclear bomb. A video of a billionaire throwing coins at a humble worker who turned out to be a lost musical genius was too perfect, too morally clear-cut. It was a modern-day fable, and he was the villain. Deals he had spent months negotiating evaporated in a single evening. Stocks in his flagship company, Croft Enterprises, were already plummeting in after-hours trading. He was no longer just a ruthless businessman. He was a public pariah, a symbol of arrogant, out-of-touch cruelty. His name, once a synonym for success, had become a punchline. He sat in the back of his limousine, the city lights blurring past the tinted windows, but he saw none of it. He was seeing the look in Elias Vance's eyes on that stage. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't triumph. It was a kind of profound pity. And that, more than the financial ruin or the public disgrace, was what shattered him. The man he had tried to reduce to a clown had looked at him and seen something broken. 2 days later, Julian was summoned to Mr. Sterling's private office. It was a quiet, wood-paneled room filled with old books and the scent of leather. It felt like a confessional. Julian was a ghost of his former self. The tailored suit was still perfect, but it hung on him differently, as if on a frame that had collapsed from within. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunted emptiness. When he entered, he saw that Mr. Sterling was not alone. Sitting in a simple armchair opposite the grand desk was Elias Vance. He was not in his janitor's uniform, but in a simple, clean shirt and trousers. He looked at Julian not with accusation, but with a quiet, waiting stillness. "Sit down, Julian," Sterling said, his voice softer now, more sad than angry. Julian sat, feeling small and exposed. The silence in the room was heavier than any words. "I imagine the last 48 hours have been educational for you," Sterling began. Julian didn't respond. He just stared at the floor. Finally, he looked up at Elias. "Why?" Julian asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Why did you stay? Why work a job like that when you had that?" He gestured vaguely, unable to articulate the magnitude of Elias's talent. Elias was silent for a moment, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was soft, without the operatic power he had displayed on stage, but with a different kind of strength. "Because my voice was a memory of my wife," he said simply, and the memory was too loud. Julian flinched, the mention of a wife touching a raw, buried nerve deep inside him. "Her name was Clara," Elias continued, his gaze distant. "She was my world, my sun. She died in a car accident 9 years ago. When she died, the music died with her. I couldn't sing. The joy was gone. So I looked for a place where I could be quiet, a place where no one would know me, where I could just be." Julian's carefully constructed composure began to crack. He felt a cold dread creeping up his spine. "A car accident?" he repeated, his voice barely audible. "Yes," Elias said. "A terrible one. A rainy Tuesday in October, on the old river road." Every word was a hammer blow to Julian's soul. He felt the air leave his lungs. He remembered that day with perfect, horrifying clarity. The slick road, the screech of tires, the sickening crunch of metal. He had been in the other car. "My wife, Amelia," Julian choked out, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "My daughter, Lily, they were with me. They didn't make it." A heavy, sacred silence descended upon the room. Mr. Sterling looked between the two men, his face a mask of dawning, tragic understanding. Julian's mind raced back to the aftermath. The police reports, the insurance claims. His team of high-priced lawyers had descended on the case, ensuring that all blame was placed squarely on the other driver. A woman named Clara Vance. They had painted her as reckless, irresponsible. It had been easier for him to believe that, to have a target for his rage and his grief. It had allowed him to harden his heart, to build the fortress of wealth and cruelty that had been his life ever since. "Your lawyers," Elias said, his voice flat, devoid of accusation but heavy with the weight of truth. "They said she was speeding. They said it was her fault. But Clara, she was the most careful person I have ever known. She would never—" His voice broke for the first time. The truth hit Julian with the force of a physical impact, knocking the last of the air from his body. He slumped in his chair, a strangled sob escaping his lips. The man he had chosen to humiliate out of all the people in the world was the husband of the woman he had spent 9 years blaming for the death of his own family. Their lives were not just parallel in their tragedy. They were inextricably, horribly intertwined. His cruelty had not been random. It had been a grotesque, fated boomerang, and it had finally come back to strike him down. He looked at Elias, truly looked at him, and for the first time, he did not see a janitor or a singer. He saw a man who had suffered the exact same wound he had, a man who had walked through the same hell. But where Julian had emerged bitter and cruel, turning his pain outward to hurt the world, Elias had turned his inward, choosing quiet dignity and silent remembrance. I didn't know," Julian stammered, the words feeble and inadequate. "Oh God, I am so sorry. For everything." The apology was not for the public humiliation. It was for something far deeper. It was a confession, an acknowledgement of a 9-year-old sin. It was the first crack in the ice that had encased his heart for nearly a decade. Tears streamed down Julian's face, hot and unfamiliar. They were tears of grief not just for his wife and daughter, but for the man he had become, for the years he had wasted nursing a rage that had been built on a lie. He had destroyed another family not once, but twice, first with his lawyers, and now with his arrogance. Elias watched him, his own eyes glistening. He saw not a monster, but a broken man, a fellow traveler in the lonely kingdom of grief. In that moment of shared pain, The roles of billionaire and janitor dissolved into meaninglessness. They were just two widowers, bound by a single tragic moment on a rainy road. "What have I done?" Julian whispered to the silent room, the question directed at himself, at the universe. "What can I possibly do?" Elias took a deep breath. The path forward was unclear, but for the first time in 9 years, he felt a flicker of something other than sorrow. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of understanding, the beginning of a new, shared purpose, born from the ashes of their two shattered lives. In the weeks that followed, Julian Croft systematically dismantled his own empire. He sold Croft Enterprises. He liquidated his stocks, his properties, his art collections. He divested himself of every trapping of the life he had built, a life that now felt like a hollow monument to a terrible mistake. The financial world watched in stunned disbelief, assuming he had gone mad. But for Julian, it was the sanest thing he had ever done. He did not disappear into ruin. Instead, he took the vast fortune he had amassed and funneled it into a single grand project. He established a new foundation, a charitable organization with a dual purpose. Half of its endowment was dedicated to supporting families affected by tragic accidents, providing financial and emotional resources to those left behind. The other half was dedicated to creating scholarships for gifted artists from underprivileged backgrounds, ensuring that no talent like Elias's would ever again be forced into the shadows by hardship. He named it the Clara and Amelia Foundation. It was an act of penance, of remembrance, of hope. It was a way to honor the women they had both lost, to build something beautiful and life-affirming from the wreckage of their shared tragedy. But Julian knew he could not be the face of it. He had no moral authority. His name was still a symbol of arrogance. There was only one person in the world who could lead this foundation with the integrity it deserved. He went to the modest apartment where Elias now lived. The world had come calling for Elian Vance after that night. Recording contracts, concert tours, a triumphant return to the world stage. It was all his for the taking. But Elias had quietly turned it all down. He had sung his song. He had honored Clara. He had no desire to return to the spotlight. Julian stood at the door, no longer a titan of industry, but a supplicant. He explained his plan, the foundation, its mission, and then, with a humility he had never known before, he made his request. "I want you to run it," Julian said, his voice steady. "I will provide the funds, all of it. But it needs a soul. It needs you. Please, Elias, help me build a legacy our wives would have been proud of." Elias looked at the man before him. He saw the profound, painful transformation Julian had undergone. He saw the genuine remorse in his eyes. He thought of all the people they could help, the lives they could change. He realized his voice had another purpose, not just for singing on a stage, but for speaking for those who had no one to speak for them. It was a second chance, for both of them. "Yes," Elias said, a small, hopeful smile touching his lips for the first time in years. "I will." 2 years passed. The Clara and Amelia Foundation became a beacon of hope. Its headquarters was not a cold glass tower, but a beautifully restored historic building filled with light, music, and art. The halls, which could have been silent and sterile, echoed with the sound of a young violinist practicing, of a painter discussing their work, of a support group sharing their stories. Elias Vance was the heart of it all. He was no longer the invisible janitor, but a compassionate and visionary director. He moved through the building with a quiet, confident grace, his presence a source of comfort and inspiration to everyone he met. He had found his purpose not in the adulation of a crowd, but in the quiet, meaningful work of healing and nurturing. He sometimes sang at the Foundation's events, his voice no longer a vessel for his own grief, but a gift he shared freely, a sound of pure, redemptive joy. Julian Croft was there too, though most people didn't know who he was. He had shed his famous name and his expensive suits. He worked as a volunteer, managing the Foundation's finances from a small, unassuming office in the basement. He was quiet, diligent, and kind. He found a satisfaction in the meticulous work of ensuring the Foundation's resources reached those who needed them most, a satisfaction that all his billions had never given him. He had traded power for purpose, and in doing so, had found a measure of peace. One evening, the Foundation was holding its annual showcase for its scholarship recipients. Elias and Julian stood together at the back of the auditorium, watching a young woman on stage. She was a pianist, her fingers flying across the keys with a passion and skill that was breathtaking. She was from a poor neighborhood, and without the Foundation, her talent would have likely gone undiscovered. She finished her piece to thunderous applause. Elias turned to Julian, a look of profound contentment on his face. "Clara would have loved this," he said softly. Julian nodded, his eyes glistening. "Amelia would have too," he replied. They were not friends, not in the traditional sense. Their shared history was too fraught with pain for that. But they were partners, bound by a bond deeper than friendship. They were two men who had found their way out of the darkness by walking toward the light together. Later that night, after the crowds had gone home, Elias stood alone on the empty stage. The single spotlight, so much like the one from that fateful night at the hotel, illuminated him. He looked out at the empty seats, but he saw a universe of possibilities. He had learned the hardest lesson of all, that true worth is not measured by what you own, but by what you give away. It is not found in the cold gleam of gold, but in the warmth of a shared humanity. A person's value is not in the noise they command, but in the quiet dignity with which they endure their sorrow, and the grace with which they help others endure their own. His voice had stopped a party, but in doing so, it had started a new life. One built not on fame or fortune, but on the simple, powerful truth that even the deepest wounds can be healed, and the most broken souls can learn to sing again.